So Braidotti's chapter, and this is the chapter 1, Post-Humanism, Life Beyond the Self, in the book The Posthuman, written in 2013 or published in 2013. This is the first chapter of that book. And Braidotti's chapter really outlines the author's commitments and basic concepts and concerns for the book here. It begins with a critique of humanism, and then it explores the basic contours and history of post-war anti-humanism, which arose as sort of a reaction against humanism, which it then uses as a starting point for articulating a theory of post-humanism. And Braidotti seeks to push beyond some of the contradictions and shortcomings of both humanism and anti-humanism to offer a simultaneously critical and affirmative theory and politics of post-humanism. So Braidotti outlines 3 main emerging schools of thought that operate within what they call or consider post-humanism. So a certain strand of liberal moral philosophy, contemporary science and technology studies, and anti-humanism influenced theories of the subject. These are sort of the 3 main strains of sort of post-humanist thought that they see sort of occurring in the intellectual landscape. And the latter of which, this anti-humanism influenced sort of critical theory of the subject, is sort of the camp that Braidotti is sort of most closely identifies with. And then finally in the chapter, Braidotti summarizes the ontological and methodological approaches and frameworks that their research on the posthuman uses, and points to some of the sort of implications, the political implications, especially for European society, and a sort of anthropocentric society and associated identities. But subjectivity is really core to the thing that Braidotti is interested in and explores, and I think it's probably also similarly going to be core to the things that we read about in this reading group over the coming weeks. So I thought maybe what we could do is we could start off by sort of sketching out Braidotti's sort of ontology and methodology, since these are the sort of core concepts and the broader picture and project of exploring what posthuman is, or posthuman subjectivity might look like to Braidotti. So yeah, Braidotti is seeking to explore a version of politics that does not merely reproduce, reify, or reinscribe Eurocentric or anthropocentric values, modes of life, and means of exploitation and othering. This, as Braidotti shows, was the fundamental problem with humanism. It failed to recognize that its model for the universal was in fact a singular, exclusive, socially constructed configuration, which assumed a particular civilizational model. And so Braidotti sort of explores this a bit on page 15, where they say, as a civilizational model, humanism fueled the imperial destinies of 19th century Germany, France, and supremely Great Britain. That's actually drawing from somebody named Davies. I can't remember his first name. They later say that this sort of depends on a sort of structure that others, people who don't fit that model, and it acquires both an essentialist and lethal connotations for the people who do get branded as others. So, there's colonialist, imperialist, and racialized valences to this version of humanism, to, I guess, most versions of humanism. All humanisms until now have been imperial, says Tony Davies, this person that Braidotti is sort of drawing on in their critique of humanism. And Braidotti doesn't spend a whole lot of time critiquing humanism, I think, because others have done that pretty effectively. They spend a lot more time exploring anti-humanism. And so but there's problems with anti-humanism too. So anti-humanism, which describes the many, let's say, postmodern critiques of humanism that were launched by continental philosophers in the post-World War II era, has perhaps been too critical and unwilling to offer affirmative visions for how things can be otherwise. So one of the amazing things about anti-humanism is that it's de-centered the sort of subject, and it's explored politics that don't depend on pre-formed or pre-existing subjective positions, but it's perhaps been too sort of dependent on critique as its methodology. And so against this tendency and sort of breaking out of the pack of these philosophers was this guy named Gilles Deleuze, who really sought to create a philosophy that could actually be used to build. And Braidotti really draws heavily on Deleuze. So Braidotti describes their ontology and methodology in a few places in the chapter, which I thought we could just reference here. The first is on page 35, where Braidotti says the following. Let me just find my way to page 35. My monistic philosophy of becomings rests, and this is very Deleuzian language, rests on the idea that matter, including the specific slice of matter that is human embodiment, is intelligent and self-organizing. This means that matter is not dialectically opposed to culture, nor to technological mediation, but continuous with them. This produces a different scheme of emancipation and a non-dialectical politics of human liberation. In other words, it's not just about different camps sort of embodying their positions and sort of fighting with each other, but more of a sort of complex unfolding. They go on to say that this position has another important corollary, namely that political agency need not be critical in the negative sense of oppositional, and thus may not be aimed solely or primarily at the production of counter-subjectivities. Subjectivity is rather a process of autopoiesis, so self-reproduction, or self-styling, which involves complex and continuous negotiations with dominant norms and values, and hence also multiple forms of accountability. This process-oriented political ontology can accommodate a post-secular turn, a position that is also defended within feminism by a variety of thinkers. So this idea of like a process-oriented political ontology basically just suggests that you don't have these sort of preformed subjects that you're relying on, but also that you're not relying on forming your subjectivity in sort of contradistinction to pre-existing subjectivities either, which can be its own challenge. And this is one of the things that this sort of post-secular turn has sort of pointed out. And I'm not going to get super into the secularism stuff. We can talk more about that if people want to discuss that. So this is why Braidotti leans away from the sort of critical and toward the affirmative. Braidotti wants to really build something better. In other words, Braidotti's ontology is materialist and also emphasizes sort of, again, potentiality over actuality. And it stresses the implications really sort of for identity politics here, because identity is actual. So identity is based on what actually exists rather than what could be. And so one of the things Braidotti is asking us is, what would it look like if our politics were oriented around potentiality, or what isn't quite yet, what could be rather than what is. So just an interesting quote I thought on Braidotti's quest to like build something better is on page 37, where they say, Post-Humanism is a historical moment that marks the end of the opposition between humanism and anti-humanism and traces a different discursive framework looking more affirmatively towards new alternatives. They say that the post-humanist perspective rests on the assumption that the historical decline of humanism it rests on that historical decline, but it goes further in exploring actual alternatives without sinking into the rhetoric of the crisis of man. So in other words, yeah, it's not couched in a language of crisis. It's really couched in a language of opportunity. It works instead towards elaborating alternative ways of conceptualizing the human subject. I will emphasize the priority of this issue of post-human subjectivity throughout this book, and they do indeed do that. So Braidotti looks at the decline of humanism, again, not as a crisis, but as many liberal moral philosophers tend to do, by the way, but again, more as an opportunity. And one of these opportunities is the opening for including the many structural others of humanism into our politics. As Braidotti says in the last paragraph of that same page, the structural others of the modern humanistic subject are able to sort of reemerge with a vengeance under postmodernity. And it is a historical fact that the great emancipatory movements of postmodernity are driven and fueled by these resurgent others. However, one of the things that Braidotti is seeking to do is not to turn these structural others into, let's say, new rigid camps, but actually something much more sort of flexible and fluid. So what posthumanism is seeking to do is actually offer an alternative to the vision of identity-based politics that we see today, a politics that Braidotti says Deleuze sometimes called sort of micro-fascisms, in the sense that identities don't just become these sort of many nationalisms that seek to outcompete and or fight for their own slice within the false universalism of humanism, or sort of within a predefined pie. They have a nice quote on that on page 47. They say, yeah, taking a strong stance against the return of fundamentalist appeals to ethnic differences by a variety of white, black, Serbian, Rwandan, Texan, and other nationalists. They're drawing on Paul Gilroy here. Paul Gilroy denounces what Deleuze calls these sort of microfascisms, and as the epidemics of our as sort of an epidemic of our globalized times. Paul Gilroy locates the site of the ethical transformation in the critique of each nationalistic category, not in the assertion of a new dominant one. He sets diasporic mobility and the transcultural interconnections up against forces of nationalism. So one of the things Braidotti's embracing here is this sort of idea of having diasporic mobility and setting up these transcultural interconnections that Paul Gilroy was advocating and writing about. So yeah, Braidotti sort of advocates this version of belonging and subjectivity, this less grounded and rigid categories, the nomadic, changing, and complex processes. And I'll just close with this last quote by Braidotti on 49. They say, in my own work, I define the critical post-human subject, and really this is what Braidotti is trying to define, is this what might the critical post-human subject look like. I define the critical post-human subject within an eco-philosophy of multiple belongings. So, by the way, environment features heavily in this, and we can talk more about that and the secularism stuff we want to later. But within an eco-philosophy of multiple becomings, as a relational subject constituted in and by multiplicity, that is to say, a subject that works across differences and is also internally differentiated, but still grounded and accountable. And the way that they're trying to set that up is by basically rooting the theory of this subjectivity in both critique and affirmative politics, which they close the chapter out on. They say, my post-human sensibility may come across as visionary and even impatient, but it is very proactive, or to use my favorite term, affirmative. Affirmative politics combines critique with creativity in the pursuit of alternative visions and projects. So anyway, I think that's the synopsis I intended to give, and I'm sure other people have other thoughts.